I was asleep in my dugout, but I was woken to hear the earth thudding all round me and the noise of exploding shells. I remember a certain amount of shivers going all round me because we realized that the great attack had started.
The Germans came over and raided us, and we had a number of casualties, and they did a hell of a lot of damage.
What he did, you see, he was clever in the fog. So our chaps, next thing they knew was that Jerry was behind them, you see, and they couldn't see.
I think the Germans were better equipped all round because they'd got bombs, hand grenades. We hadn't got any hand grenades, and the Germans had got these stick bombs.
Of course, the worst things were the mini-werfers. They were terrific. You heard the pop when they were set off, and then you heard a shh, 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 shh. It got louder and louder, and you ducked down until it burst. The explosion was terrific.
If you're a history nerd like me, you probably love historical video games, and one of the most ubiquitous historical games is Battlefield 1, one of the few FPSs to be set during World War I. I made a video about that topic, by the way, check that out here. The elephant in the room with Battlefield 1 is that the gameplay does not seem at all to be like the true fighting of the real World War I. The conflict, notorious for its stagnant positional trench warfare, feels different from the rapid-paced, small unit fighting of Battlefield 1. But believe it or not, a lot of fighting in World War I didn't look like this. It looked like this. The game actually has a loading screen fact pointing this out, and it's true, lots of fighting in World War I was not trench warfare. Even on the Western Front, the end of the war saw the beginnings of maneuver warfare, utilizing combined arms, heavy firepower, and small independent squads of shock troops to quickly take enemy positions and gain ground. Many groups tried this throughout the war, but undoubtedly the most successful were the German Stormtroopers. So in this video, we're going to look at how the real Stormtroopers fought, the weapons they used, their moments of success, and of course how to simulate these legendary fighters in Battlefield 1. So remember to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell, follow me on social media, do all that fun stuff, and let's just get right into it. In order to understand the Stormtroopers, we need to realize the part they played in a massive evolution of warfare. Going into the war, many of the world's nations assumed that new weapon systems would simply enhance the way that they already fought wars. A large mass of soldiers would advance towards the enemy using faster-firing rifles, while low-level officers followed behind to keep order and give commands. Alongside artillery, machine guns would be used in their own isolated groups to punch holes in the enemy positions. Some nations did see how things could change, as illustrated in the Boer and Russo-Japanese wars. A tandem style of fighting was actually conceived of to address the new technology, which saw smaller groups of decentralized riflemen advance towards the enemy, utilizing cover and concealment, while other riflemen and heavier weapons provided suppressive fire. However, this had some fatal flaws. Communication technology and techniques between the artillery and infantry was insufficient to make covering fire effective. Further, the infantry without good command tended to find the first piece of cover and just stay there and shoot rather than advance towards the enemy, eventually running out of ammo and stalling the attack. As such, there wasn't a good blueprint on how to fight the coming war. World War I was a very confusing time initially, and no one really knew what to do, with some suffering major casualties in the opening battles of the war. And when in doubt, people dig trenches. As it turned out, trenches still protect you from most stuff, like bullets and shrapnel. We still see it today in the Ukraine war. And alongside some barbed wire and machine guns, these positions are very hard to take. Arguably, the most critical piece of kit in the whole war was the shovel. But in these circumstances, taking ground was hard, and trench warfare heavily favored the defense. and this was a problem for everyone, especially Germany. Germany was arguably militarily superior to its enemies, but it was less economically independent, which made it easier to blockade and starve out. As the war continued, blockade made it harder and harder for Germany to maintain its war economy or its regular economy, and eventually they were going to have to give up. Germany did have hope if it could break the stalemate of trench warfare, quickly taking the capital of France and forcing a surrender, but to do that it had to revolutionize how this new era of war was fought. After the initial settling into trenches, the Western Front armies of World War I heavily relied on artillery. Instead of using the infantry as the main method of force, armies would shell enemy positions for weeks or even months, which actually would do severe damage to any forces in that area, and thus leaving it open for infantry to move in and occupy. This worked well at first, but the defending armies realized that they could simply withdraw from the frontline positions while the shelling was happening there, and since the shelling took so long and they knew exactly where the attack was going to come, they had plenty of time to reinforce that area with more men. This was the development of elastic defense, which let the enemy shell and then briefly occupy the frontline trenches that the defenders had abandoned. But since there was still a big old no man's land in between the new front line and the rest of the offense's forces, they were isolated without good supply or communications. In turn, the defense, which by this point had reinforced the manpower in that area further back, simply counterattacked, often pushing the offense back to their original lines and rendering the whole operation fruitless. To counter this, various armies, especially the Germans, developed what is referred to as Biddle's modern system of warfighting. This system utilizes cover and concealment, dispersion and low-level command of forces, suppression, and combined arms to make greater gains. This wasn't too different from what some armies, especially the British, had conceived of before the war, but at that time the technology and force employment methods weren't really there. Communication wasn't good enough, and non-commissioned officers, NCOs, who were the officers actually doing most of the on-the-ground commanding, weren't trained for independent action. Rather, they were more there to just push the troops forward to carry out the pre-existing orders from on high. Now let's look at how the Germans were able to develop the Stormtroopers in the face of this. The German military tradition was actually uniquely suited for developing these troops, both on the tactical and strategic levels. Strategically, the Germans, and before them the Prussians, were heavily influenced by Antoine-Henri Jomini, a Swiss military officer who served under Napoleon. Jomini was of course influenced by Napoleon, and he was an advocate for the battle of annihilation. In a war of this nature, the aim was to destroy the enemy in one decisive battle, similar to what Napoleon did on various occasions. By the time we get to World War I, the German High Command wanted to embody this idea, and they planned to quickly and decisively beat their enemy, in this case France, often referencing the Battle of Cannae. This was embodied by the Schlieffen Plan, which sought to rapidly take Paris, forcing a surrender and winning the war in one fell swoop. Of course, this didn't happen in this war, and they had to fight a war of attrition where the focus was to slowly grind down the enemy, a form of war that the Germans would lose since they were less economically viable. The Germans would spend the rest of the war trying to get back to a place where they could implement Jomini's annihilation strategy. Enter the tactical side of things. Since fighting Napoleon, the Prussians had been moving towards giving low-level officers more autonomy, again influenced by Napoleon. Initially, this independence really only extended to high-level officers, but by the time of the Wars of Unification, this ethic had begun to trickle down. In the 1860s, the Prussian Army Chief of Staff Helmuth von Moltke really codified this concept with something called Auftragstaktik, or mission tactics. Moltke wrote in 1869, quote, "Diverse are the situations under which an officer has to act on the basis of his own view of the situation. It would be wrong if he had to wait for orders at times when no orders can be given. But most productive are his actions when he acts within the framework of his senior commander's intent." Here, Moltke articulates one of the fundamental parts of modern Western warfighting: commander's intent. Instead of a high-level officer calling every single little shot and micromanaging everything, despite not actually being at the battlefield or being able to adapt, the low-level officers would be given a task, and they in turn would figure out for themselves how to accomplish it. But once again, the novel circumstances of World War I turned back the clock on everyone's tactics, and this didn't really play out as hoped initially. But pretty soon, the Germans saw some progress. Aided by their military culture that rewarded initiative and innovation, low and mid-level German officers really took the lead on developing a new way to fight the war, hoping to implement Moltke's mission tactics to achieve Jomini's annihilation strategy. On March 2nd, 1915, the German Army High Command commissioned the creation of shock troop units, which would move across no man's land and create gaps in the enemy lines for larger groups to then move into and exploit. The initial concept of this unit was interesting, as it would be 2 pioneer companies, about 500 men who specialized in demolition, and it would give them metal armor. A 37mm cannon would be used to support them with direct fire. This force employment was never combat tested, as training showed that body armor made the troops get tired very quickly, and the direct fire cannon was vulnerable to enemy fire. Though, fun fact, this armor is actually used on the Battlefield 1 troops and on some of the specialty classes there, so this does actually have some historical accuracy to it. By November of that year, the officer in charge of the program was replaced by Major Willy Rohr. Yes, Willy is just his first name, I don't know why. Who wasn't a pioneer, but instead was actually part of one of the guard rifle units, which was more used to frontline combat and being heavily armed. Under Rohr, the concept of the Stormtrooper, or Sturmtruppen, was born. I'm sure I said that right. We'll get into the weapons later, but these forces used the components of the modern system, which we talked about earlier. Rohr championed the independent decision-making of NCOs, which enabled the formations to move more effectively. Since this created actual good command on the battlefield, the soldiers were able to use the terrain for cover and concealment better than they could with mass wave formations, and also be dispersed so as to be able to attack from multiple angles and avoid being taken all out at once. And they also still had the coordination to be able to keep going together and keep up the attack. Heavy firepower, in addition to better communication techniques with artillery, made the Stormtroopers very effective in the use of suppression and combined arms. Unlike the weeks-long artillery barrages of other campaigns, the Stormtroopers worked alongside hurricane barrages, which didn't aim to totally destroy the enemy, but rather to suppress them. This was effective and efficient, as suppression took about 10% as many shells to suppress an enemy as it took to destroy the position outright. The use of artillery, both from the rear lines as well as more mobile trench mortars, also helped in combined arms. Artillery and infantry weapons have inverse weaknesses, making them work great together. Artillery was powerful but less accurate, and could force the enemy's heads down, while infantry advanced to get close enough to fight. Then, the infantry weapons, especially machine guns, would also more accurately suppress or kill the enemy, forcing them to either get killed or stay still, and thus making them even more vulnerable to artillery. The Stormtroopers' use of combined arms also went down to the level of man-portable weapons, with rifles and machine guns suppressing the enemy at longer range, while troops with grenades, pistols, and blades were used to come in close and finish off the enemy at close range. Under the cover of artillery, often in the early morning fog, Stormtroopers would get as close as possible to the enemy, cutting wire and getting in range to immediately engage. Once it was time, they would hit the enemy hard and fast, focusing in on a weak part of the trench system and pushing in. If they came across a hard target, like a well-dug-in machine gun, they would simply go around it. The name of the game was Speed and Power, and Stormtroopers used these two tenets to punch holes in the enemy lines. Once they were in, they would often roll up the trench, attacking the enemy from the rear and sides and opening an even bigger hole. More men would then come in behind the Stormtroopers to finish the job and consolidate these gains. Since the attacks happened fast and with no warning, the enemy forces weren't able to bring reinforcements to the area quickly, making it much easier for the Germans to actually keep the areas and repel counterattacks. Under Rohr's leadership, the new units were promising and got the attention of Chief of Staff Falkenhayn by May of 1916. A month before, they had actually been moved up from a company size of about 240 men to the battalion size of about 1,000 men. That's another thing we always kind of lose with video games and scale. These Stormtrooper units wasn't just like 10, 20 guys. This was hundreds of people. While it was a difficult process, German units were incrementally rotated through Rohr's training, with the process getting even bigger when Ludendorff came into control of the army later that year. In keeping with Moltke's military tradition, Ludendorff said, quote, "I thought I ought to give way to the experience of officers at the front." By October of 1916, there was a Storm battalion in every German army corps on the Western Front, and they would only get more common with time. Through this time, Stormtroopers had been seeing combat. The first organized attacks were in the Vosges Mountains in early 1916, where they stormed 2 French emplacements. From there, they saw lots of action at the massive Battle of Verdun. But as the war began to wind down, Germany was getting more and more desperate, even totally changing their military structure to account for losses of men. But at the same time, more and more soldiers were trained to be Stormtroopers, to the point where they were becoming a regular appearance on Europe's battlefields. Their general tactics had become commonplace not just by special Storm battalions, but across the German army. Enemy forces were beginning to do the same, especially the British and Italians and Canadians, but they were far less effective in their dissemination of tactics across their forces. In October and November of 1917, the Stormtroopers arguably scored their most important success at the Battle of Caporetto. To that point, the Italians and Austrians had been dueling over the Isonzo River and had fought 11 battles for it with little ground gained either way. As Germans came in to reinforce the Austrians, however, this changed. In the span of about a month, the Central Powers advanced over 90 miles, largely due to the Stormtroopers. These units were feared and made their way into classic literature as they made an impression on writer Ernest Hemingway, who was on the front. Quote, "It's the Germans attacking." The word Germans was something to be frightened of. We did not want to have anything to do with the Germans. But their biggest challenge would be on the Western Front. By 1918, fresh American forces were starting to come into the Allied trenches, and the Germans had to act fast if they were ever to take Paris and sue for peace. They had effectively won on their other fronts, including at the Battle of Riga, which didn't use Stormtroopers but used similar style tactics very effectively. But without taking Paris, they would probably lose the war. So on March 21st, 1918, the Germans launched an offensive, the beginning of what was called Operation Michael, and the beginning of the German spring offensives. In 3 days, they took over 50 miles of ground, shattering previous records on an offensive success. However, the Stormtroopers had a fatal flaw. They were too damn fast. While they were great at making the initial holes in the enemy lines, they kept going and going further and further into enemy territory, and they moved too fast for the rest of the German army. They lost out on supplies and ammo, and even got out of artillery range, making their attacks less effective. Plus, the men just got too tired and had to slow down. By outrunning their lifelines of success, the Stormtroopers stalled, and not long after, the Allies counterattacked the exposed forces, erasing many of their gains. Stormtroopers also had another flaw, one that you may experience yourself in game depending how good you are. They had very high casualty rates, which was unsustainable since they took so long to train, leading to a reduction of standards by the end of the war. 4 more of these spring offensives would be launched through the spring and summer, each less successful than the last. By August, the Americans had filled the Allied trenches, and any hope for victory was lost. Stormtroopers continued to fight until the end of the war, and were unable to beat back the Allied counteroffensives, and while they had lost to this war, the tactics they pioneered became far more popular. not just in Germany, but with the other armies as well through the interwar period, and of course, it defined how World War II was fought. Okay, so now the part of the video you've actually been waiting for. What weapons, maps, and tactics can we use in Battlefield 1 to recreate the Stormtroopers? Most of the weapons used by the Stormtroopers are actually in game, so that's really cool. So recreating them isn't too hard. However, it is a little annoying to be able to match the guns and gadgets. Despite what you may think, the main weapon of the Stormtrooper was still the bolt-action rifle. Being German, they used the Gewehr 98, although they generally used some experimental carbine version like the 98B, and there is no Gewehr 98 carbine in the game. The Gewehr 98 Infantry is the best match in-game. It's the full-length version with iron sights. The G95, which is actually Austrian, does have a carbine variant, but it's got like that optic thing on it, so you could get away with using that as well, although the optic isn't really accurate. But as you may imagine, the gadgets of the Stormtroopers were more in line with the Assault class. So to play Stormtrooper, there are actually 3 classes you can play and still have a historically accurate loadout: Assault, Support, and Scout. The Medic class actually doesn't really have any historically accurate guns for Stormtroopers. Staying with Scout for a second, the gadgets you should be using are K-bullets and the flare gun. While neither of these are technically common for a real Stormtrooper, they are most in line with the type of fighting they would have done. The Allies had many tanks, so running into these, especially late in the war, might have been common. Further, flares would be very helpful for coordinating with friendly units, which of course was very important for the Stormtrooper tactics, and also for low light conditions, where they also sometimes operated. You can also have a bayonet on your rifle, since melee combat would have been a big part of that fighting. For specializations, there's a few you could use here. They're kind of the same for all the classes. Quick unspot, cover, hasty retreat, inconspicuous awareness, and slink are the kind of basic ones that all make sense for this. Looking to the 3 universal slots, you're going to want to keep it basic for all your classes. Your pistol should be the Luger P08. Stormtroopers used pistols a decent amount actually, and if you play as Scout, it would be especially helpful when you get close to the enemy. Believe it or not, SMGs were like really experimental and only came into wide use at the very end of the war, so pistols were kind of just the close-range weapon used in that time period. The other pistols in game are either not German, or they were too unreliable and expensive like the C96, so they weren't really historically used by the Stormtroopers. For grenades, just use the standard grenade, and for your melee, you can use a variety of weapons, but the most common and historically accurate would actually be the combat knife, not the trench knife. Clubs could also be used as well. In terms of playstyle, you're going to want to be reasonably aggressive. You're not going to want to stay back and snipe necessarily. Be close-ish to the lines and shoot at mid-range, and then close in and pull out your pistol when you need to as well. And of course, preface any advance against an enemy by throwing a grenade at them. Moving on to support, your firepower increases a lot. Since Stormtroopers were really big on combining firepower and speed, the development of the light machine gun was key to their success. In Battlefield 1, the 2 machine guns that were actually historically used by Stormtroopers are the MG-15 and the LMG-08. Both of these have lightweight variants, and those are what you should be using because, again, the Stormtroopers loved light, fast stuff. While Battlefield is generally a run-and-gun game, machine gunners historically would have been a little more stagnant, even if they had mobile guns, so keep that in mind if you want to try and play with historic tactics. Move alongside your squad, and then take up a good position to suppress the enemy, while your teammates move in and probably actually do most of the killing for you. Your suppression role as support is increased with one of your gadgets, the Airburst Mortar. Again, Stormtroopers loved their firepower, and being able to have some mobile artillery was absolutely part of the equation. You can see here how kind of these combined arms work. Me and my buddies here are all in this little crater, and we're all grouped together because we're getting shot at and we have to hide, which makes us really easy targets for the mortars. So of course, you and your squad can try to do this against other enemies. For your third gadget, you can just pick the ammo crate, since the Germans, again, wanted to move fast, but they also didn't want to run out of ammo, so that would be helpful for you as well. If you wanted to be a bit more aggressive, you could also equip the P08 artillery, which is a historically accurate, beefed-up pistol used by the Stormtroopers before SMGs really developed. Again, SMGs super late in the war. For specializations, Unbreakable and Pin Down also work, in addition to the ones we've already talked about. And finally, for Assault, the only SMG, interestingly, you can really still use and be historically accurate is the MP-18 in the standard version. Shotguns were only used by Americans, and the concept of SMGs as such was still very, very experimental in World War I. It didn't even feature in the German spring offensives we talked about earlier, and they were only used in the last couple of months of the war against the Americans. There were experimental variants and stuff like that did exist, but they tended to be unreliable and expensive, so they, again, were not really being used. The MG-18 was the only submachine gun of the war to be actually fielded in significant numbers, and while they didn't change the outcome, you can be sure that they were effective, since everyone and their mother made them common weapons in armies after the war. Your main gadget is going to be the anti-tank grenade, surprise, surprise, and it will work well with one of your main tactics, which will just be to grenade spam the enemy position before rushing them with your SMG. Picking your second gadget is kind of hard, and you kind of have two options. They did not use rocket guns, but they did initially have the 37mm field gun, at least in kind of the experimental conceptions of the Stormtroopers. The AT rocket gun is about that size, so it's similar, but obviously a very different style, and the in-game model is actually British. You could also get away with using dynamite to just further increase your grenade spam, although they weren't technically using dynamite either. None of the specific specializations for Assault or Scout are historically accurate, so just stick to those basics plus those other two for the support class. In terms of heavy weapons, you have a couple of options. While that 37mm field gun initially proposed for use with the Stormtroopers wasn't used, the anti-air gun in-game is the proper size. That being said, that is actually a British model, and of course it's stationary, it's too big, it fires too quickly. Not technically historically accurate, but in terms of the effect on target, it would be similar. The field gun is too big, it's 76mm, so that's not historically accurate. Using vehicles is also inaccurate for Stormtroopers. Throughout the war, the Germans had very few tanks, and if you were to use one, it actually would be more historically accurate to just use it like an artillery piece, staying back and giving fire from a long range, rather than actually like advancing on the enemy. That being said, this wasn't done by Stormtroopers, so other German forces. The Flame Trooper kit is also historically accurate, and so is the Sentry kit as well. Although the armor on the Sentry kit is, it's from an experimental version of the Stormtroopers, it's not even really the same thing, but the LMG they're using is actually a German one. We've already touched on playstyle a bit, but the names of the game are Coordination, Speed, and Aggression. Always use the weapons you have in the best way you can, but tend towards being a bit too aggressive than to be a bit too passive. Try to move as a unit, and obviously this is much easier with friends, If you're going for historical accuracy above everything else, have more of you using rifles, but obviously use SMGs or LMGs is generally something that's more fun and more effective in-game. When you do find a group of enemies act fast, have your LMG quickly set up where they can suppress the enemy position, even if they aren't necessarily going to get the kill shots. Then have your riflemen and SMGs just grenade spam them and maneuver to try and flank out the enemy, getting close and attacking from different angles. In general, just play to the strengths of your loadout, but be as aggressive as practical. You can also try avoiding hard targets, and so don't attack those front on, but either go around or flank them. Also just avoid tanks. Tanks are scary. So what about maps and factions? Well, starting with factions, obviously playing as the Germans is the most historically accurate to play Stormtrooper. That being said, the Germans also fought alongside the Austrians, so you can get away with some maps that have an Austrian faction as well. Regarding maps, we can get more specific. The most historically accurate base maps to play are on Amiens, Argonne Forest, San Quentin Scar, Giant's Shadow, Ballroom Blitz, and, surprise, Monte Grappa. All of these maps involved not just Germans, but specifically German Stormtroopers, since they are based on late war battles. This is kind of cool as well, because since they picked mostly late war battles for this game, it also shows that they did their historical research, because this is also when most of the fluid fighting you see in-game would actually be happening more. So let's roughly go in chronological historical order here. Monte Grappa is the earliest of our maps, and it takes place in the mountains of Italy. The map technically takes place at the third Battle of Monte Grappa, which did not have any Germans. But the location is about the same as the first Battle of Monte Grappa, around Monte Grappa, who would have thought, which did have Germans, especially German Stormtroopers. Monte Grappa was actually the end of the Battle of Caporetto and was fought through November and December of 1917, and it was actually the battle that stalls out that central advance and kind of keeps Italy in the war a little bit. The other 5 maps take place over the 1918 Western Front. San Quentin Scar takes place in late March of 1918 and is fought around San Quentin, which was one of the starting points of the German offensive Operation Michael. Amiens caps off Operation Michael, as this is about as far as the offensive made it. Notably, the real battle did not take place in the city itself, but actually far to the east of it. Also, if you look up the Battle of Amiens on Wikipedia, it'll show you the Allied counteroffensive months later. This in-game battle is actually just the culmination of Michael, and this is in April of 1918, not the one in the summer and fall of 1918. Fast forward 5 months, and the last 3 maps all take place during the 100-day offensive, the Allied counterattack to the Germans that ultimately seals the war. First, we have the fighting in the Argonne Forest between September and October of 1918, which ultimately pushes the Germans back. This trend is continued with the map's Giant's Shadow, which takes place at the Battle of the Selle in late October near the town of Le Cateau, and concludes with Ballroom Blitz, which is around Sedan in early November, just a few days before the war's end. Notably, the building in Ballroom Blitz is based on another building not close to the war at all, but the last 3 maps also do feature rail lines, which is historic, since one of the main objectives for that 100-day offensive was to take out the German rail lines. 5 other DLC maps are also historically accurate for Stormtrooper battlefields. Verdun Heights and Fort de Vaux both take place during the Battle of Verdun, the former in February and the latter in June of 1916. This was the battle where the Stormtroopers were really first put to the test. Just before Monte Grappa, we also have the Caporetto map, the central offensive powered by the Stormtroopers in the fall of 1917. Soissons and Rupture both take place after the German spring offensives, which the Stormtroopers did take part in. In these battles, they're actually on the defensive as the Allies are starting to counterattack. 4 other maps have some possibility of being historically accurate for Stormtroopers. These are Passchendaele, Albion, Nivelle Knights, and Prise de Tuach. I don't know how to say that. Which all take place through the summer and fall of 1917. Further, Brusilov Keep and Galicia had German soldiers involved, but the likelihood of Stormtroopers is pretty low. So, overall, Battlefield 1 is pretty good at letting you play as historically accurate Stormtroopers in a historically accurate way on historically accurate battlefields during real battles. The biggest drawback, in my opinion, is that you can't pair a bolt-action rifle with anti-tank grenades. But if you could do that, or if you're like on one of those custom servers, then it's perfect. And it still works really good otherwise. So that's it for this video, everyone. Thank you so much for watching to the end. I know I took a long time with the historical context. I'll have chapters. You already know that if you're here. But yeah, thank you so much. Have a great day, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.